Our next speaker, she's a developer with a focus on accessibility, and she's a regular attendee and occasional speaker at the Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup in Seattle. She's a developer at SitePen and a contributor to Dojo 2. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sarah Higley.
So my talk is about something that I bet all of you thought you'd already succeeded at today, escaping the office. Twist, you haven't yet. So really quick, Nick said who I am. I work on Dojo 2, a web framework. Dojo's been around for a while. It's working on version 2. I'm really happy that I get to work on accessibility in Dojo, something I care a lot about, and yeah, I get to spend a lot of time making sure that it's baked into Dojo. And that kind of brings a lot of really interesting design challenges when designing interfaces for other developers, because it's this really interesting field where it matters a lot, but a lot of developers who make front-end components don't necessarily think about it a lot or have a lot of experience with it. So it's this interesting challenge that brought me to this talk. TypeScript is a design tool. And I know, we're developers, we're not designers, not that kind of design. And I know, like, as developers, it's really nice to sometimes focus on drilling into details of implementation, and I love talking about why, a type isn't narrowing or hating on smoosh as much as anyone else, but sometimes we need to step back and whether we think we are designing code or not, we are actually, every time we write code, we're designing. And it's just that our users aren't the end users who see an app in the browser, they're other developers. So the people we design for are ourselves and anyone else currently working on the code in the future, currently working on the code now, but designing for our future selves. For new contributors to the code who might jump into it, and these are the ones I'm sure you've probably thought about because they're the ones we come across the most because we're developers, we think about ourselves, everyone's a little navel-gazing. But part of designing an open source framework is that we think about designing for the people who are going to consume it a lot, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. People who use Dojo or who use really any open source library as a consumer. And this is the office of those people. I'm sure it looks exactly like all of your offices. But here's the Caveman coder, the person who just wants to smash your code until it works. The horde of interns, they're always slowly coming for you. And the inventor, I will get to the inventor. I'm sure you can have a picture in your mind already. But as much as these are caricatures, they all represent valid use cases. I've been up at 2 a.m. with a client project that needs to get done, and there's some library I haven't spent much time with, and I just want to do the most simple thing and get it to do what it's supposed to do. I've been a beginner and not wanted to look up docs, not really known what's going on. And I have totally been the inventor when I find a feature that's missing. I'm like, let's just make my own thing. Screw it. So these are all, real people who will actually use your code. And you probably work with them. I don't, because all my fellow coworkers are wonderful and also in the audience. But it's open source. People are going to, anyone who wants to build a framework will hopefully at some point run across Dojo, at least that's the hope, and they will run across issues with it, and then they'll go submit a GitHub issue that I probably don't actually want to read. No, I do submit GitHub issues. But I want to, you want to cut down on the ones that don't matter, the cruft. And to do that, you want to put the work into designing it at the start. So I'm going to look at a button, very simple use case. It should be, it looks, obvious. It has text or an icon or both, one or the other. Should be really basic. But let's go into some early requirements. The icon is optional, obviously. Here's the one I care about more. Alt text should be present if the icon adds meaning. So obviously if it's an icon-only button, the icon must add meaning because there's no extra text. But sometimes it adds meaning if there's also text present. So it's not just if icon is absent, or if text is absent, icon adds meaning. Binary. You have to, if you have, say, a menu of options, and you have the word options and a little 3-bar menu icon, that actually adds meaning because it's indicating that the button opens a drop-down. So you want to have some text that's like options open menu. So there are multiple permutations of icon text, icon alt text possible. And there's a predetermined set of possible icons because you have a finite, icon font or set of SVGs. So let's start with this guy. He wants to build a very simple icon-only button. And he just wants to do the minimum possible until it looks right to the Caveman. So this is our first take on interface. It does everything you need it to do. It has an optional label, it has an optional icon type, and it has optional icon alt text, and that will let developers create all possible correct sets of buttons. So Caveman takes this interface. He does this because that's all he wants, and it works. There's a button with an icon on it, so he thinks he's done. But the problem is this is the output. There's a button, there's an SVG, at least we can put role equals image on there, but that's about it. And what a screen reader hears when it gets this button? Nothing. Here's button, pretty much. So it's a fail. It's something that has failed, and the developer hasn't realized it. And it's easy to blame the Caveman and say, he did it wrong, it's his fault, we can't control that. But we can actually do a little better because it's something we care about, and we know going in that not everyone else will. So yeah, Caveman's totally done. So let's make him not done. This is take 2. The icon is optional, but if the icon is present, the alt text must be there. And the icon type is still a string, which you might have noticed will be a problem in the future. But for this guy, now he gets an error. A nice, well-described error because the architects of TypeScript have put such effort into making good errors. So now Caveman goes, okay, smashes keys some more, gets an alt text, and just with that addition, we get to do all this extra stuff. We get to put a title on the SVG, we get to correctly associate it with the SVG element, and that ARIA label by is actually required for certain browser screen reader combinations, which you don't expect anyone else to know when they use it, so you get to do this for them just with the addition of alt text. And so that works for him. Let's move on, these guys. They're new, and they're a zombie horde who are coming for you via email. And it's a long chain that's cluttering up your inbox, and you don't want that, obviously. So obviously at some point you can't do any more. If someone wants to use your library, they're gonna have to look up something at some time. But we can do a little better here. Icon type isn't just a string. Yeah, there's strings, but it's more specific than that. And also, if you noticed, as a reminder, this is the interface from before, alt text here is required if the icon is present, but that's not always true. Sometimes the icon is presentational, and you don't actually want to force alt text there, or you might get redundancies like this, where this guy's building a button with both a text search and a search icon, and with a type magnifying glass, because that makes sense. Probably they just misspell search and wouldn't notice. So they get a search icon, or a search button, with the icon not working, and with duplicate text. So now, this is a little better than hearing nothing if you're on a screen reader, but now you hear search, search, which, not great. And yeah, I know you don't get a missing glyph box if you're using an SVG icon, but it was a better visual. Don't at me. Okay, so yeah, let's try again. Let's use an enum this time for the icon type. So now you'll get code hinting in VS Code or whatever editor. I'll tell you what's below there. Pretend you can see that. And I've split out icon into presentation icon and content icon. And this is one of the few cases, one of the few examples where I've found a literal type presentation true to actually be useful. Because it doesn't add much meaning if it's always true, but it's kind of a psychological trick. You don't want to make alt text always optional because then people will leave it off by default even when it's required. But by putting presentation true, you kind of force them to make a decision. Do I put presentation true or do I put alt text with some string? And then you have below there, it says, oh yeah, you can't see it. It'll say icon type, presentation icon, or content icon, a union of the two, and optional label as string. And so the intern horde, one of the intern horde, now gets this nice little hint drop down, and they can choose search, and they won't misspell it, and they won't, accidentally type magnifying glass, and they've chosen presentation true because, it's pretty obvious, alt text or presentation. This one's presentational. And you get a button with, as far as a screen reader is concerned, just text that says search, which is perfect. Not in my image because I forgot to do that. And we've put aria hidden equals true on the SVG, and that just effectively hides it from screen readers, and you're kind of good as far as that goes. So, inventor, my favorite. He wants to add everything in a pony. And let's be honest, I've been there. Sometimes you just need the pony. But let's put a bookmark there. Before I really talk about him, I want to talk about flexibility and control, which I've kind of talked about. I've talked about aria as a place where I kind of assume that I know more than whoever is going to use it. That's not always true, but on average, I probably know more about the accessibility, the proper accessibility affordances for a widget than average developer consuming a button. But there's a lot of places where that isn't true, where somebody might want to add a pony, and that's kind of valid. I think that's valid. And aria is this really weird mix where it's if you're not aware of what it is, or if you've heard about it, it stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it's a set of attributes that add semantic meaning to your DOM. And this is really important for assistive tech, but it's often invisible. And it's very broad. And when you start designing widgets with accessibility in mind, you start asking these questions that you might not otherwise ask, like, what is a button really? What is a button versus a link? And to a lot of people, they do the same thing. You click on it, it does something. But there's a semantic difference. A button is an interactive element that performs an action on the page, as opposed to a link, which is a thing that takes you to a different location. That can be a location in the same page, like a ID, href, but it's a different location. It modifies the URL. And a button is something that does something. And so when you're adding aria, you start to ask these questions, and doing something is pretty broad, if we're being honest. You can control a pop-up, you can toggle a state, you can submit a form, you can do other things that I'm not really thinking of. Maybe you have a large select list and you want to select one and have the button do something somewhere else on the page. There are a whole bunch of use cases that I can't really think of at design time. And the thing is, all of these might look the same. If you're creating a button, you don't think about these semantics necessarily. You're thinking about, this button needs to open a dialog. Let me pass a function to the onClick property, and it'll bind to that event, and it opens the dialog, and it works on the surface. But it might not have the proper semantics. You might have used a link accidentally, or on purpose. There are some valid ways to use links in dialogues, but let's ignore that. But it's complicated. The semantics are complicated and invisible. So here's a kind of preview of the things you might want. Type is the most well-known: submit, button, reset, that sort of thing. Probably because you've made a form before and you've noticed that submit button will do the proper thing and a type equals button will not. But there's also things like aria expanded, which will let people know that the button opens something like a tooltip or a drop-down menu or a dialog. Something like aria has pop-up, which only actually refers to things that pop up, like a dialog or an alert, not to a tooltip or a menu, fun fact. Or aria pressed, which will tell assistive tech that it's a toggle button. And the thing is, these are all common use cases, and you want people to be able to do them, but you don't want them to think about this. But there's all those other use cases where it's hard to control for it at design time. And when we were initially making Dojo widgets like button and text input, we tried to design everything into the interface. We were really trying to avoid having something like just a free-form aria bucket, because that's kind of a lot to handle. But we ran into all these edge cases. Like we designed text input, and then we designed combo box. And the thing is, to properly make a text input work in a combo box, you need to add things like ARIA controls, ARIA expanded, ARIA active descendant, and ARIA owns. And especially the last two, active descendant and owns, are things you never put on a text input except for a combo box. Like that is the single use case where you'd ever do that. Like text inputs generally don't make things come up or own other elements, which is just a way of saying there's an element in the hierarchy of the DOM under the input. So those are things that it doesn't really make sense to design into an interface. What would you even call that? Like text input property is combo box? So we ended up with this kind of compromise where there's an ARIA bucket, which is less than ideal, but it's there. So if you know what you're doing, you can go and modify stuff. But then we also account for all the common use cases like pop-up and press and tooltip and stuff like that. So having said that, let's go back to the pony. This, let me see if I can. This guy also animates when you focus because this is important. This is important stuff. You need to be able to do this with our widgets. I might have made this late at night. I admit to nothing. So back to flexibility versus control. There are things we want to control because I expect people to mess them up if they're given control of it, if they have to overwrite it in order to make their wonderful pony. I would honestly probably mess stuff up if I had to overwrite the button and make the pony, like sometime in the future when I wasn't necessarily paying attention to all this. So a lot of that's attributes on the button element, things like disabled, read-only. All the event handlers are just annoying to copy over. Correctly handling things like expand or ARIA expanded, ARIA press, like toggle buttons and pop-ups, because the pony might open a menu. You might want that, menu of ponies. So you want to keep control of the button element itself, and to know what you want to cede control of. I spent a while thinking about ways I might want to extend the button, and I know there will always be stuff missed, but by looking at the general thrust of what I thought of, things like tooltips and custom content and add-ons, all of this kind of falls into a certain category where we're trying to modify the content within the button. And so originally when we designed widgets, we had these giant render functions where it kind of compiled everything else into this one. It assembled all the DOM. We use virtual DOM, but essentially DOM in one place. And when we got to extending stuff, that was a bit of a problem because then you had to overwrite the entire render function to get a slightly different thing, like a pony instead of an icon. So for button, it made sense to split out things like get content, which currently is a string. It's that string like search or icon text or whatever. But it could be an HTML element that has, extra ponies. There might be too many ponies. And render pop-up icon, which does, it's called pop-up icon because we have a pop-up button. But it could be any icon. And those are very simple. Like the pop-up icon just returns the icon and that's it, and the get content just currently returns a string and that's it. And then we explicitly type the return because although get content is a string now, it could very well be an element. Same for render pop-up icon. And then render, hopefully no one will ever override that. And then there's protected versus private as well, where you can control more explicitly. All of our widgets are reactive, so we don't have public methods, but yeah, properly privatizing things is good. So that kind of setup allows the inventor to pretty easily do something like this, where they're extending the pony button properties, extending button properties to be pony button properties and overriding icon. And they can import content icon and presentation icon because we split those out and then just add, the pony type, which is definitely a type somewhere else. And then they just override the render icon function within their extended class. And you can see we're using generics to pass in properties. So if you want to extend properties for something, you can then pass that into the button class, and that'll correctly work, which is great. Then it works. He doesn't have to write a whole new button widget and mess everything up, which ends up in a better experience for the users, hopefully. So kind of the whole theme of this is looking at who knows best. And accessibility is this really interesting place to work in, again, because while I can't say I know best all the time, or not me, but the collective thought of everyone who works on Dojo and everyone at design time will probably end up being better than the person at runtime who's making decisions on the fly. But then they need that flexibility to be able to create whatever pop-up it is that they're wanting the button to control, or whatever action it performs, with proper semantics. And then there's this balance between when does someone else know best and when do you know best. And this isn't just accessibility. This matters for internationalization, performance, whatever specific area you're thinking about a lot at design time is probably something that you might know better how to do than the person who ends up using it. So it's we've spent a lot of time kind of separating out this area of what is it we know and what is it we want to control and where is it we want to provide flexibility. For example, ARIA label is this really interesting thing where it provides an invisible label, or it overwrites it's the accessibility exposed label. Like if on a button you put ARIA label, it'll overwrite whatever text you have in that button to be the label exposed to assistive tech. And it's great for things like form fields if you wanted an invisible label, which I don't recommend for other reasons. But if you do want an invisible label, it's great. But translators, the most common translators, Microsoft's one and Google Translate, will not translate strings within ARIA label, which is kind of a deal killer for us because we need things to be internationalized. But it might change in the future. So you want to reserve control of that and that implementation when you do something like a hidden label, which I'm now going to get to because this is an escape room talk. So now it's your job to escape. And the challenge is to create an interface for an optionally hidden label. So it could be visible, it could be hidden on a text input. And this is one of the wonderful accessibility things that so many people ignore that messes a lot of people up because there's no real way to get around a missing label. So we need to solve this. So the requirements are the visible label should be able to support custom text like a red star thing for required. There must be labeling text even if it's invisible. We don't actually do this in Dojo as a side note because it's possible to want to label somewhere else in the DOM and associate it with foreign ID. So in reality, that's not really possible to control and provide flexibility, which is one of those kind of difficult trade-offs. But for this challenge, you do want to enforce there being a label. Say you're designing a widget for internal consumption or something, and you can't enforce that. And you know this thing about ARIA label. And ARIA label only accepts a string, and you might want to use it in the future. So you want to keep this. You want to keep this possibility to switch to ARIA label in the future, and that will only accept a string, and you don't want to change your interface because then people will complain and go on GitHub and raise issues. So these are your requirements. And this is the poor kitten who needs to escape. You need to help this kitten. This is a bad example of an interface, but a start. So if you get the chance, if you want to do this, tweet me. That's my Twitter handle. Those are the TSConf hashtag is for the conference, and then use this hashtag, and I will role play one of the Caveman coder interns or inventor and see if I can break your interface in interesting ways. And yeah, that's it.